In 2001, a black teenager named Devin never returned from his friend's birthday sleepover. 20 years later, a trapdoor was discovered under the bedroom carpet in that same house. The new family, the Millers, had only owned the house for a year. They'd heard the old stories, of course, whispers in the neighborhood about the original builder, a strange man who liked secret spaces. But they were just stories, weren't they? Until the day Mr. Miller decided to replace the worn carpet in the upstairs guest room, the room that had once belonged to a boy named Kevin Henderson, Devin's friend. The carpet was old, stained in places, and as he pulled it up, the tack strips clinging stubbornly to the floorboards, he saw it. A faint outline in the wood, almost perfectly square. He ran his hand over it. It wasn't just an outline, it was a cut, a door. His heart began to thump a little harder. Could this be one of those rumored hidden rooms? He called his wife, Sarah. She knelt beside him, her eyes wide. "What do you think it is?" she whispered, almost afraid to say the words aloud. There was no handle, no knob, just the faint seam. Mr. Miller fetched a pry bar from the garage. The wood around the edges was old, and it groaned as he carefully worked the tool into the gap. Dust, thick and gray, puffed out. What could possibly be under there? The thought of an empty crawlspace was somehow less comforting than the thought of finding something. At least an empty space would be just that, empty. But the air that escaped smelled stale, old, and something else, something unsettling. With a final crack, the trapdoor loosened. It was heavy. Together, they lifted it. Darkness stared back at them from a square hole in the floor. A ladder, crudely made of wooden rungs, descended into the black. Sarah gripped her husband's arm. "Maybe we shouldn't," she said, her voice trembling. But they had to know. What if it was just an old root cellar, or a Prohibition-era stash spot? Mr. Miller shone his phone's flashlight down. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a small, cramped space, no bigger than a closet. Dirt floor, stone walls, and something else. A shape in the corner. Not just a shape, several shapes. Old, discarded things, it looked like. But why here? Why hidden so deliberately? He leaned further. The light caught a glint of metal, then the dull fabric of what looked like a bag. I think there's stuff down there," he said, his voice hoarse. Sarah felt a chill snake down her spine, a primal fear that had nothing to do with spiders or the dark. This felt different. This felt wrong. Who would hide things in a secret room under a child's bedroom? And what kind of things? They didn't dare go down. Not yet. The silence in the house pressed in on them, heavy and expectant. The smell from the hole was stronger now, a mix of damp earth and something else they couldn't quite name, something that made the hairs on their arms stand up. "We need to call someone," Sarah said finally. "The police." The word hung in the air. Police. For a dusty hole in the floor? But the feeling, the deep, gut-wrenching feeling that this wasn't right, that this was tied to something awful, was too strong to ignore. They remembered the stories then, not just about the builder, but about the boy who went missing. Devin, the boy who was last seen in this very house, in this very room, 20 years ago. Could it be possible? After all this time? The thought was a cold stone in their stomachs. Mr. Miller slowly lowered the trapdoor, not wanting to disturb whatever lay beneath. The thud, as it settled back into place, seemed to echo through the quiet house, a sound of finality, and yet a sound of a terrible beginning. What had they uncovered? The police arrived within 20 minutes. 2 uniformed officers at first, then a detective named Washington, his face grim as the Millers recounted their discovery. He listened patiently, his eyes scanning the room, lingering on the outline of the trapdoor beneath where the carpet had been. He'd heard of the Devon case, of course. A cold case. A tragedy that had haunted the town for 2 decades. The thought that this dusty square in the floor, could be connected, it was almost too much to hope for, and yet too dreadful to contemplate. Detective Washington had the Millers wait downstairs while he and another officer examined the room. The air upstairs grew thick with unspoken questions. What were they finding? The Millers sat at their kitchen table, coffee untouched, listening to the muffled sounds from above. Footsteps, hushed voices, the creak of the trapdoor being lifted again. Time stretched, each minute an eternity. Then, Detective Washington came down, his expression unreadable. He asked them about the previous owners, the Hendersons. The Millers only knew they'd bought the house from a family who had lived there for about 5 years, and before that it was the Hendersons. They'd moved away shortly after Devon. Detective Washington nodded slowly. "We're going to have a forensics team come in," he said. "I think you were right to call us." His voice was low, serious. "We found some items in the space beneath the floor." Sarah Miller held her breath. "What kind of items?" He hesitated for a moment. "A backpack," he said. "A pair of sneakers. A watch. Simple things. Ordinary things. But in that hidden, dark space, they were anything but ordinary." The detective's gaze was heavy. "We believe they may have belonged to Devon." The name spoken aloud in their home, in connection with this terrible discovery, made it all too real. Devon, the boy who vanished. His things, hidden like secrets, just a few feet beneath where another child, Kevin Henderson, had slept every night. How could that be? How could no one have known? The forensic team arrived, quiet and efficient, their presence transforming the Millers' home into a crime scene. They documented everything, photographed the small, dark room from every angle. Each item was carefully bagged and tagged. The watch, its band frayed, its crystal cracked. The backpack, a popular brand from the early 2000s, faded and dusty but still intact. The sneakers, laces, still tied, as if just kicked off. Detective Washington watched them work, a knot tightening in his own stomach. He'd seen a lot in his years, but this had a particular chill. A child's belongings, entombed. He thought of Devon's mother, Maria. He'd have to be the one to tell her. After 20 years of silence, of not knowing, what would this news do to her? Would it bring closure, or tear open old wounds that had never truly healed? He knew it would be both. The items were taken away for analysis, to be checked for any forensic evidence, any clue as to what happened to Devon. Was he in that room? And if so, how did he get there? And why didn't he get out? The questions multiplied, each one darker than the last. The trapdoor itself was a puzzle. It was well concealed, the seams tight. From inside the hidden room, there was no obvious way to open it. No handle, no latch visible from below. It seemed designed to be opened only from above. The detective ran a hand over his jaw. This wasn't some accidental hiding spot. This was deliberate. Later that day, Detective Washington made the call he'd been dreading. He found Maria, Devon's mother, still living in the same small house where Devon had grown up, surrounded by his pictures. When he told her about the trapdoor, about the items found, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then, a choked sound, a sob held back for 2 decades. "His watch?" she finally whispered. "You found his watch?" It was the one she'd given him for his 14th birthday, just before he disappeared. The thought of it lying in the dark, all these years, it was unbearable. But amidst the crushing weight of renewed grief, a tiny, fragile seed of something else began to sprout. Not hope, not yet, but a desperate need for answers. After 20 years, they were finally closer to knowing what happened to her son. The detective asked Maria to come to the station to see if she could formally identify the items. As he hung up, he looked back at the Miller house. The sun was setting, casting long shadows. The house looked ordinary from the outside, but now, he knew, it held a 20-year-old secret, a secret that was finally, painfully, coming to light. The initial search of the hidden room also yielded something else, something that didn't immediately make sense. Tucked into a crevice between two of the rough stones that formed the wall, forensics found a small folded piece of paper. It was brittle with age. Carefully, they unfolded it. It wasn't a note. It was a drawing, crude, childlike, a stick figure, lying down, with what looked like stars above it, and next to it, a single letter written over and over. The weight of the past settled heavily on Maria as she walked into the police station the next day. 20 years. 20 years of birthdays missed, of holidays empty, of a silence in her house that screamed Devon's name. Every detective who had cycled through the cold case unit over the years had offered sympathy, but no answers. Now, Detective Washington, a man she'd never met, was telling her they'd found something. Something real. He led her to a small private room. On a table, covered with a cloth, were several evidence bags. He gently pulled back the cloth. Maria's breath hitched. The backpack. It was Devon's. Faded, yes, but she knew the worn patch on the front where he'd tried to iron on a band logo and singed the nylon. Her hand flew to her mouth. Then, the sneakers. His favorite pair, the ones he'd saved up for months to buy. And the watch. Oh God, the watch. The silver band. The slightly scratched face. She'd fastened it onto his wrist herself that birthday morning. His smile so bright. Tears streamed down her face. Silent. Unstoppable. These were not just items. They were pieces of her son. Echoes of his life. Tangible links to the boy who had been stolen from her. It's his, she whispered, her voice thick with unshed grief. It's all his. Detective Washington gave her a moment, his own heart aching for her. This was the part of the job that never got easier, bringing a parent face to face with the ghost of their lost child. He then showed her a photograph of the drawing found in the hidden room. The stick figure, the stars, the letter K repeated. Maria frowned, her brow furrowing through her tears. K? She repeated. Kevin? His friend? Kevin Henderson? The boy whose house it was? It had to be. Devon and Kevin had been inseparable that year. Kevin's birthday sleepover. That was the last place Devon was ever seen. The police had interviewed the Hendersons, Kevin and his parents, back in 2001. Their story had been simple. Devon had been there. They'd played video games, eaten pizza, and then, sometime during the night, Devon had apparently just left, walked out. No one heard him go. No one saw him leave. It was a story Maria had never fully believed. Devon wouldn't just leave without a word. Not her Devon. He was responsible. He would have called. The investigation at the time had been thorough, or so they said. They searched the Henderson house, the yard, the surrounding neighborhood. Nothing. No sign of Devon. No indication of foul play at the Hendersons' home. The case quickly grew cold, another name on a long list of missing children. Maria remembered Mrs. Henderson, a nervous bird-like woman who wrung her hands and offered tearful apologies. Mr. Henderson had been quieter, sterner, insisting they knew nothing. And Kevin had been just a boy then. 14, like Devon. He'd seemed scared, confused. He'd said Devon was his best friend. He'd cried. Had it all been a lie? Detective Washington knew they had to find the Hendersons. They'd sold the house about a year after Devon's disappearance and moved, reportedly to another state. Finding them after 19 years wouldn't be easy, but it was essential. Kevin would be in his mid-30s now. What did he remember? What did he know? As Maria looked at the drawing again, a new wave of pain washed over her. If Devin had drawn that, what did it mean? Was he trying to tell someone something? Was he alone in that dark place? Trapped? The thought of her vibrant, lively son, stuck in a hidden, silent tomb, it was a special kind of hell. She remembered Devin. He was always drawing, always full of energy. He loved astronomy, talked endlessly about wanting a telescope. The stars in the drawing, her heart clenched. He dreamed of being an engineer, of building things. He was kind, funny, a good son. He didn't deserve to vanish. He didn't deserve to be forgotten. The police began their search for the Hendersons. Old records were pulled, databases cross-referenced. Days turned into a week. Maria waited, suspended between a fragile hope for truth and the dread of what that truth might be. The discovery of Devin's belongings had reopened everything, made the loss raw and immediate again. The community, too, was stirred by the news. The old case, the one everyone remembered with a shudder, was suddenly alive again. Whispers started, just like 20 years ago. What really happened in that house? Did the Hendersons know more than they let on? The house itself, the Millers' new home, became a focal point of grim fascination. People drove by slowly, looking at the windows, imagining the hidden room beneath the floor. It was a house marked by tragedy. Finally, Detective Washington got a hit. An address for Kevin Henderson in a neighboring state, about 3 hours away. He was married, had a steady job, lived a seemingly normal life. But how normal could it be if he carried the secret of his friend's disappearance? The detective made plans to visit him. He needed to see Kevin Henderson's face when he heard about the trapdoor, about Devin's things being found in his childhood bedroom. He needed to know if those childhood tears were genuine, or if they masked something far more sinister. Detective Washington drove the 3 hours to meet Kevin Henderson with a sense of unease. What would he find? A man haunted by the past, or someone who had successfully buried it? Kevin Henderson lived in a modest suburban house, a newer build, a stark contrast to the old, secret-filled house where he'd grown up. He answered the door himself, a man in his mid-30s, average height, with tired eyes that widened slightly when Washington identified himself. "Police? What's this about?" Kevin asked, his voice steady, but a flicker of something, apprehension, crossed his face. Washington didn't beat around the bush. "It's about Devin Wells," he said, watching Kevin closely. "Your childhood friend. The one who disappeared from your house in 2001. Kevin's composure wavered. He paled. "Devin? After all this time? What about him?" He invited Washington inside, his hand visibly trembling as he gestured towards the living room. The house was neat, impersonal. No pictures of his parents visible. Washington explained the new discovery, the trapdoor, the hidden room, Devin's belongings found inside. As he spoke, Kevin sank onto the sofa, his face ashen. He stared at Washington, his mouth slightly agape. "A trapdoor? In my old bedroom? I don't understand." His shock seemed genuine. But Washington was a seasoned detective. He knew shock could be faked. "You never knew about any hidden room in that house, Kevin?" Kevin shook his head, slowly at first, then more vehemently. "No, never. We heard stories, about the guy who built the house, that he was eccentric, put in weird stuff, but it was just neighborhood legend. We never found anything." "I swear," Washington pressed him. "Think back to that night, Kevin. Devin's sleepover, your birthday. What happened?" Kevin closed his eyes for a moment, as if trying to summon a 20-year-old memory. His account was largely the same as it had been back then. Pizza, video games, talking late into the night. He said he fell asleep, and when he woke up, Devon was gone. He assumed Devon had gotten homesick and left. He'd done that once before, Kevin added, a detail Washington didn't recall from the old files. Not from my house, but from another friend's sleepover. Just got up and walked home. Did you or your parents search for him when you realized he was gone? Washington asked. Yeah, a bit, Kevin said hesitantly. My dad looked around the yard, down the street. We called his house, but there was no answer at first. Then later, his mom called us, frantic. It all sounded plausible, yet a trapdoor, a secret room, right under his bed. How could he not know? Devon's things were in that room, Kevin. His backpack, his shoes, his watch, and this. Washington showed him a photo of the drawing. The stick figure, the stars, the letter K. Kevin stared at it, his face unreadable. I don't know what that means, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Did Devon ever mention feeling scared in your house? Or finding anything unusual? No, Kevin insisted. He loved exploring. We both did. We used to joke about finding secret passages, like in books, but we never did. Not a real one. Washington felt a growing frustration. Was Kevin telling the truth, or was he a consummate liar, hiding a terrible secret for 2 decades? He decided to push harder. Kevin, this room was directly beneath your bed. The trapdoor was under your carpet. It's hard to believe you lived there for years and never knew. Kevin looked up, his eyes filled with a sudden raw emotion. Fear? Guilt? I didn't know, he insisted, his voice rising. You have to believe me. If I had known, if I thought Devon was in there. He couldn't finish the sentence. He buried his face in his hands for a moment. When he looked up again, his eyes were wet. That night, he began, his voice cracking. Devon, he was obsessed with those stories about hidden stuff in the house. More than usual. He kept saying, what if there really is a secret room, Kev? What if we could find it? Washington leaned forward. And did you look? Kevin hesitated. A long pause stretched between them. Yeah, he finally admitted, his voice low. Yeah, we kind of poked around, tapped on walls, looked in closets, in the basement. Devon was convinced there was something. He even tried to pry up a loose floorboard in my room, near the window. He thought maybe there was a space under it. A floorboard. Near where the trapdoor was eventually found. And what did you find? Washington asked, his voice calm, dangerously so. Kevin shook his head. Nothing. Just solid floor. My dad came in, heard us messing around and got mad. Told us to stop before we broke something and go to sleep. So we did. His father, Mr. Henderson. Washington made a mental note. If Kevin and Devon were actively searching for a hidden space in that very room, and Mr. Henderson interrupted them, what else might Mr. Henderson have known? Or done? So you're saying your father knew you were looking for a hidden space in your room that night? Kevin nodded. Yeah, he wasn't happy about it. This was new. A deviation from the simple he just left story. A small crack in the facade. Kevin Henderson seemed genuinely distressed, but was it because of a dawning, horrible realization, or because his carefully constructed story was beginning to crumble? Before Washington left, he asked one more question. Kevin, if Devon was in that room, how do you think he got there? And why didn't he get out? Kevin just stared at him, a look of profound horror on his face. I don't know, he whispered. I truly don't know. But Washington sensed he was holding something back. Or perhaps he was only just beginning to confront the terrifying possibilities himself. The forensics team went back to the Henderson house, now the Miller's home, with a new focus. Kevin's admission that he and Devon had been searching for a hidden room, specifically in that bedroom, on that very night, changed things. They examined the trapdoor again, meticulously. It was old wood, but the cuts were surprisingly clean, as if made with care. And there was something else, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. Tiny, filled-in nail holes around the perimeter of the door, as if it had once been more permanently secured, then later prized open and left to sit flush with the floor, hidden only by the carpet. Who would have the tools and the reason to do that? Inside the cramped, dusty space, the team conducted an even more thorough search. They sifted the dirt floor, brushed the stone walls, and then they found it. The mid-spike, the discovery that twisted the knife deeper into the heart of this tragedy. Tucked behind a loose stone near the bottom of the wall, almost at floor level, was a small, tattered notebook. Not Devon's school notebook. Something cheaper, smaller, the kind you could buy at any corner store. Its cover was damp and stained, the pages warped. Carefully, they opened it. Inside, in pencil, was writing. Faint, smudged, but legible in places. It wasn't Devon's handwriting. It was more erratic, a scrawl. Some pages were just random doodles, frustrated scribbles. But then, there were words. Dates, tally marks. The first few entries were hard to decipher, but one date stood out. Devon's birthday, the day he disappeared. Underneath it, a single word. Trapped. Then, more entries. A few days apart. No one hears. So dark. K tried? The letter K, again. Was this Devon's desperate chronicle? The handwriting was shaky. Was he injured? Weak? Another entry. Heard them. Above. Dad. Dad. Whose dad? Kevin's dad? Mr. Henderson? The implications were horrifying. If Devon was alive in that room, writing this, hearing people above him, why wasn't he saved? The tally marks seemed to count days. 7, 10, 12. How long had he been alive in there? The thought was unbearable. It painted a picture of unimaginable suffering, of hope dwindling in suffocating darkness. This wasn't a case of a boy accidentally falling into a hidden space and succumbing quickly. This was prolonged. This was torture. The final legible entry was just 2 words. So cold. The pages after that were blank, or just showed faint, meaningless impressions, as if the writer had lacked the strength to continue. The discovery of the notebook sent a shockwave through the investigation. This was no longer just about finding a missing boy's remains. This was about murder, or at the very least, a criminal level of negligence so profound it amounted to the same thing. Detective Washington felt a cold fury rise within him. Someone knew Devon was in there. Someone let him die. The Millers, when informed of the notebook, were devastated. Sarah Miller couldn't stop crying. Their home, their children's home, had been the site of such a terrible hidden agony. They started making plans to move. They couldn't stay there. Not anymore. The house felt poisoned by the secret it had kept. The focus of the investigation now shifted squarely onto the Henderson family, particularly Mr. Robert Henderson, Kevin's father. If Devon wrote Dad and heard them above, it pointed directly to the family living in the house. Kevin's admission that his father had interrupted their search for a hidden room that night took on a far more sinister meaning. Had Mr. Henderson discovered Devon in the room later? Or worse, had he put him there? But why? What possible motive could there be? The police delved into the Hendersons' past. Robert Henderson had been a carpenter, skilled with tools. He would have known how to properly seal or unseal a trapdoor. There were no prior criminal records, no obvious signs of violence in their history. They were, by all accounts, an ordinary family. But ordinary families sometimes hid extraordinary darkness. Detective Washington knew he needed to talk to Robert Henderson and his wife Susan, and this time, it wouldn't be a polite inquiry. It would be an interrogation. The notebook was the key. It was Devon's voice, reaching out from the grave, pointing a finger. The image of those tally marks, counting down the days of a boy's dying hope, would haunt the detective. He had to find justice for Devon. He had to know who was responsible for letting that hope extinguish in the cold, silent dark. The search for Robert and Susan Henderson intensified. They hadn't stayed in the same state as Kevin. Tracing them took another week of painstaking work, sifting through old utility bills, property records, anything that might leave a digital or paper trail. Finally, they were located in a small, remote town several states away, living a quiet, almost reclusive life. Detective Washington and another senior detective made the trip. They found the Hendersons in a rundown cottage at the end of a long dirt road. Robert Henderson was older now, his hair gray, his face etched with lines, but his eyes still held a guarded, watchful quality. Susan Henderson seemed even more frail and nervous than Maria had described her from 20 years prior. When they saw the detectives, a look of stark fear passed between them. They knew why they were there. Washington didn't waste time. He laid out the evidence, the trapdoor, Devon's belongings, the notebook. He watched Robert Henderson's face as he described the tally marks, the desperate words. Henderson remained stoic, his expression unreadable, but his hands, resting on the worn Formica tabletop, were clenched into fists. Susan Henderson, however, began to crumble. Her breath came in ragged gasps, tears welling in her eyes. "It was an accident," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "A terrible, terrible accident." Robert shot her a sharp look. "Susan, be quiet." But it was too late. The dam had broken. Washington focused on Susan. "What kind of accident, Mrs. Henderson?" Susan looked at her husband, then back at Washington, her face a mask of misery. "Devon, he was so curious. He and Kevin, they were always looking for that place." Robert had warned them. That night, after Robert told them to go to sleep, Devon must have gotten up again. Her story came out in broken pieces, punctuated by sobs. Apparently, Devon, driven by youthful curiosity and the thrill of discovery, had continued searching after Kevin fell asleep. He'd found the trapdoor, somehow managed to pry it open, and gone down to explore. The old ladder, she claimed, was rickety. He'd fallen. He'd hit his head. Robert Henderson finally spoke, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "I heard a noise, a thud. I went into Kevin's room. Kevin was asleep. The carpet was disturbed. I pulled it back. I saw the trapdoor was open a crack." He paused, his gaze distant. "I lifted it. Devon was down there. He was groaning. He'd hit his head, like she said. He was disoriented." "And what did you do, Mr. Henderson?" Washington asked, his voice dangerously calm. "I panicked," Henderson said. "He wasn't supposed to be there. I didn't know what to do. He looked bad. I thought he might die. I thought we'd be blamed." "So you closed the trapdoor on him?" Washington's question hung in the air, heavy and accusatory. Susan let out a wail. "No, not like that. Robert went down there. He tried to help him up, but Devon," he was mumbling, not making sense. "Robert got scared. He thought maybe Devon had seen something else in that room. Something we didn't want anyone to know about." Washington's eyes narrowed. "Something else? What was in that room, Mr. Henderson?" Henderson remained silent for a long moment. Then reluctantly, "Old things. Things from the previous owner, the builder. We never cleared it out. Some old tools, some boxes. Nothing illegal. But it was a mess. If police came, questions would be asked." It sounded weak, unconvincing. "So Because you were worried about some mess, you left a critically injured boy trapped in a dark hole. Susan was shaking her head violently. We thought he'd just be quiet for a bit, that he'd come around. Robert checked on him later. He said Devin was asleep. We thought in the morning we'd figure out what to do. Make up a story, say he ran away. And in the morning? Washington pressed. Henderson's face was grim. In the morning, he wasn't moving. He was cold. I checked for a pulse. There was nothing. He looked away, unable to meet the detective's gaze. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't tell anyone. Kevin would be implicated. Our lives would be ruined. So, I put the carpet back. I nailed the door shut more securely under the carpet. I told Susan we'd never speak of it again. It was a horrifying confession, a tale of cowardice and monstrous inaction. They had listened to a boy die beneath their feet, all to protect themselves from what? Scrutiny? Inconvenience? Washington felt a surge of disgust. The notebook. Devin had been alive for days. Writing. Hearing them. He wasn't dead in the morning, Mr. Henderson, Washington stated, his voice like ice. We found his notebook. He was alive for days. He wrote about hearing you. He counted the days. Robert Henderson stared at him, his composure finally shattering. His face went pale, then a mottled red. No, that can't be. He was still. Susan sobbed uncontrollably. Oh God, what did we do? The story of a quick, accidental death and a panicked cover-up was a lie, or at least a self-serving delusion. Devin had been alive, conscious, trapped, and they had known. Or, at the very least, Robert Henderson had known. Had he checked again after that first morning? Or had he deliberately ignored the faint sounds, the desperate hope of the boy dying beneath his son's bed? A former neighbor had recalled Mr. Henderson being unusually agitated in the days following Devin's disappearance, spending a lot of time in the yard, near the side of the house where the guest room window was. Had he been listening? Or ensuring silence? The full truth was still obscured by their fear and self-preservation, but one thing was clear. Devin Wells hadn't just died by accident. He had been left to die. The interrogation of Robert and Susan Henderson continued for hours, separately and together. Their initial story of a quick, accidental death followed by a panicked cover-up began to fray under the weight of the evidence, especially the notebook. Susan, consumed by guilt and fear, eventually broke down completely. Her account painted a more damning picture of her husband's actions and her own passive complicity. According to Susan, after Robert found Devin in the hidden room, injured but alive, his primary concern was not Devin's well-being, but the potential discovery of the room itself and what it might imply. The Hendersons, it turned out, had been using the hidden space for something they didn't want discovered. They were storing undeclared cash from Robert's under-the-table carpentry jobs, avoiding taxes. It wasn't a fortune, but enough to make them paranoid. Devin, in his disoriented state after the fall, might have seen the cash boxes. Robert's fear was that if Devin reported the fall, or the room, their financial secret would be exposed. It was a petty, selfish motive for such a monstrous outcome. Susan admitted Robert had initially said Devin was just stunned and would be fine. He'd given him some water, but Devin didn't get better, he grew weaker. Robert, increasingly desperate, didn't call for help. Instead, he made the decision to keep Devin hidden, hoping he would recover on his own, or, if the worst happened, that his death could be concealed. Susan confessed she heard sounds from the room for several days, faint moans, a tapping. Devin's notebook confirmed this. She had pleaded with Robert to do something, to call an ambulance anonymously, but he had refused, convinced they were in too deep. He'd become more controlling, more menacing, warning her to say nothing. He'd even reinforced the trapdoor from above, making it harder for Devon to escape, if he'd even had the strength. He told Kevin the thumping noises were just the old house settling, or rats in the walls. The dad in Devon's notebook, hearing them above, it was all chillingly true. Robert Henderson, when confronted with Susan's detailed confession and the notebook's timeline, finally abandoned his pretense of a quick, accidental death. His version was still steeped in self-pity and attempts to minimize his culpability, but the core truth emerged. He had actively, consciously, chosen to let Devon die, rather than risk exposure for his minor financial misdeeds. He claimed he never intended for Devon to die, that he kept thinking Devon would miraculously recover, or that he'd find a way to get him out later, anonymously. But later never came. The sounds from below grew fainter, then stopped. He'd convinced himself Devon had finally succumbed quickly, peacefully. The notebook, with its tally marks stretching over nearly 2 weeks, was a brutal refutation of that self-deception. The K tried? In Devon's notebook, took on a new, heartbreaking meaning. Perhaps Devon, in his delirium, hoped Kevin knew he was there, hoped his friend was trying to reach him, unaware that Kevin was sleeping soundly above, oblivious, while his father actively worked to ensure Devon's silence. The investigation found no evidence that Kevin knew about Devon being trapped. He was just a child, and his father had carefully insulated him from the horror unfolding beneath his bed. The trauma for Kevin, upon learning the truth about his father, would be immense. Robert Henderson was arrested and charged with second-degree murder, arising from criminal negligence and unlawful imprisonment, resulting in death. Susan Henderson, due to her cooperation and the evidence of coercion by her husband, faced lesser charges related to obstruction and failure to report, though the prosecutor acknowledged her testimony would be crucial. The news of the arrests and the horrifying details of Devon's last days sent shockwaves through both the Hendersons' new remote community and Devon's old hometown. For Maria, Devon's mother, the truth was an almost unbearable agony. To know her son had suffered for so long, so close to help that never came, was a fresh hell. The image of him, alone in the dark, writing in that notebook, hoping, waiting, it would haunt her forever. Yet, amidst the pain, there was also a grim sense of validation. She had always known Devon wouldn't just walk away. She had always felt something was terribly wrong in that house. Now, the world knew it too. The hidden room, once a forgotten space, had become a tomb, a testament to a secret kept for 2 decades. The simple items found within it, the backpack, the shoes, the watch, the heartbreaking notebook, told a story of lost potential, of unimaginable cruelty born from cowardice and greed. The legal proceedings would be long, but for Devon, a measure of justice, however delayed, was finally in motion. The trapdoor had been opened, and with it, a truth more terrible than anyone had imagined. The trial of Robert Henderson was a somber affair. The courtroom was packed, Maria Wells present every day, a stoic figure of maternal grief. Kevin Henderson, looking broken and older than his years, testified against his own father. His voice choked with emotion as he recounted the night of the sleepover and his father's strange behavior in the days that followed, details he hadn't understood at the time, but now viewed through a lens of horror. Susan Henderson also testified, her voice barely a whisper, recounting her husband's decisions and her own fearful inaction. The centerpiece of the prosecution's case was Devon's notebook. Enlarged copies of its pages were shown to the jury. The faint pencil marks a silent scream from the past. The tally marks, the desperate words, "No one hears." So dark. Heard them. Above, Dad painted an undeniable picture of Devon's suffering and Robert Henderson's culpability. Henderson's defense attorney tried to argue diminished capacity due to panic, a desperate attempt to portray him as a man who made a terrible mistake under pressure, not a cold-blooded killer. But the evidence of Devon's prolonged suffering, the days he lay dying while Henderson went about his life just feet above, systematically dismantled that defense. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, their verdict was guilty of second-degree murder. Robert Henderson received a sentence of 15 years to life in prison. For Maria, there was no elation, no sense of victory. Just a profound, weary sadness. Devon was still gone. No prison sentence could change that. But there was, perhaps, a small measure of something else. A sense that the world had finally acknowledged her son's life, and the terrible injustice of his death. Susan Henderson received a lighter sentence, probation and community service, largely due to her cooperation and the clear evidence she had lived in fear of her husband. Kevin Henderson, free of legal culpability but burdened by the weight of his family's secret, disappeared from public view, seeking to rebuild a life shattered by his father's actions. What happened to the house? The Millers, unable to bear living there, sold it at a significant loss to a developer who, after much public debate, decided to demolish it. The community felt it was the only way to cleanse the land of its tragic history. Before the demolition, Maria was allowed one last visit. She stood in the empty guest room, the trapdoor now sealed by the police, a stark square on the floorboards. She didn't go near it. She simply stood by the window, looking out, remembering her son's laughter, his dreams. She left a single white rose on the windowsill. The hidden room, the source of so much pain, would soon be gone, reduced to rubble. But its story, Devon's story, would remain. A haunting reminder of how secrets, buried in darkness, can fester and destroy, and how the most ordinary of places can harbor the most extraordinary of evils. Devon's body was eventually released to Maria. She held a funeral 20 years late, but attended by hundreds from the community who had never forgotten the boy who vanished. He was laid to rest beneath a simple stone, engraved with his name, his dates, and a single star, a nod to his love for astronomy, and perhaps to the stars he'd drawn in his final desperate message. The case of Devon Wells was officially closed, but for Maria and for all who knew him, the memory of his bright life and the dark tragedy of his end would endure. The silence in her house was different now, still filled with his absence, but no longer with the torment of not knowing. Now, it was filled with a sorrowful understanding and a quiet determination to keep his memory alive, not as a victim, but as the vibrant, hopeful boy he had been. The years that followed brought a fragile kind of peace for Maria. The raw agony of the trial faded, leaving behind a dull, persistent ache that she learned to live with. She became an advocate for families of missing children, sharing Devon's story, not to dwell on the horror, but to emphasize the importance of hope, persistence, and the need for answers, no matter how painful. The site where the Henderson house once stood remained empty for a long time, an overgrown lot that neighborhood kids avoided. Eventually, a small memorial park was created there, a quiet green space with a bench and a young tree planted in Devon's memory. Sometimes, Maria would go there and sit, watching children play in the distance, a bittersweet smile on her face. She often thought about Kevin Henderson, wondering how he was coping with the terrible legacy his father had left him. She hoped he had found some measure of healing, some way to move forward from the shadow of that hidden room. The objects found with Devon, his backpack, his sneakers, his watch, were returned to her. She kept them in a memory box, along with his school photos and favorite books. They were painful reminders, yes, but also precious connections to the son she had loved so fiercely. The notebook, however, remained in the police evidence archives, too stark a testament to his suffering for her to keep. But its words were seared into her memory. The trapdoor was gone, the house demolished, the guilty party imprisoned, yet the story lingered, a cautionary tale whispered in the town. A reminder that darkness can exist in the most ordinary of places, behind the most ordinary of faces, and that the search for truth, no matter how long it takes, is a testament to love's endurance. The world had moved on, as it always does. New headlines replaced old tragedies. But for Maria, and for those who remembered Devon, his light, though extinguished too soon, still cast a faint glow. A reminder of a life that mattered, a life that was tragically, senselessly cut short, but a life that would never be truly forgotten. The quiet closure was in the knowing, in the final acknowledgement of his fate, and in the small, enduring ways his memory was honored. It wasn't happiness, but it was a form of resolution, a resting place for a grief that had wandered for 2 decades. Have you ever heard of anything like this? Share your thoughts or stories in the comments.